Hey, everybody, I want to welcome you to Office Hours. So glad that you've joined us. And for those that are watching this afterwards, I apologize that the link that went out somehow got a little bit mixed up, but we are ready to go to kick off the fall season of Office Hours. These are events designed for our members to be able to engage together. Sometimes it's the opportunity to have a casual discussion and a chat together, and other times it's actually to dive into a particular topic. And today I wanted to introduce you to Rik Adamski, who's the president of Ash and Lime, who specializes in revitalizing downtowns and neighborhoods through very distinctive planning practices. And we'll touch on what his approach is and his firm and how that differs from maybe some of the things that are commonplace in the world of public engagement and consulting and plan development. He's got a lot of experience working for major planning organizations and cities of all sorts of different sizes, and has really focused on a participatory approach to community development. Rik has spoken a lot at various conferences and things like that. And as he assured me, he also speaks a lot, no matter who he's chatting with. So we're in for a good ride. And Rik, do you want to just begin by introducing yourself a little bit more and maybe describe even how did you come up with the idea of doing the work that you're doing and what is it that really stands out for you as you think of how to introduce yourself this way?
Okay, great. So I'm president of a firm called Ash and Lime that has worked in communities ranging from less than 1,500 to Houston and Dallas and Fort Worth, places of all sizes, some places that are a lot more kind of traditionally walkable urbanism, some places where you have to squint your eyes in order to see anything. In fact, we've even worked in strip suburban shopping centers. The approach that we use, it's very interesting because we've been doing this for 11 years, and the details of how we work to make a living and to be effective have changed. But the basic principles that we started with have not changed. You know, do what you can with the resources you have. Try something small, and if it works, keep going. Involve people at the deepest level possible. Those sorts of things. Find assets and fill in gaps, right? Those sorts of simple things are very much part of our practices. We've now worked in I think we're pushing 35 communities, mostly in Texas. But when we started, there were a few ideas that had some foundational influences on us. One of the biggest ones was, Strong Towns was kind of starting to take off at that time, if you can picture 11 years ago. And you had this thing called the Better Brainerd Report. I don't know if everybody here has had the chance to read this. But basically it was, okay, what if we come into this neighborhood and find some simple things to do that are low budget that might be able to have a very transformative impact upon this community? We decided when we first started, our model was what we might call Better Brainerd on steroids. So we would go into a downtown and we kind of said, okay, what are 30, 40 things that we can do with the resources we have, with the people who are actually here that can help to move the needle? A very interesting thing, when we first started, we thought what we were doing primarily was giving a report to the city and giving the city a strategy that they could implement. Once we got more into it, we found out that that was only part of what we were doing. That's a very important part of what we were doing, but we also found that we were giving tools and resources to the people who were the stakeholders so that they could run with the ball and so that they could do something transformative. And the biggest wins that we ended up getting early on were not necessarily from the city immediately acting upon it, but from developers and business owners and citizens taking some of these ideas and running with the ball. So a lesson in constant humility, I find, because it's all about figure out what the next steps are. But once you're spending a lot of times talking to people, and once you're spending a lot of time doing things that can be done with modest resources, what we found is your main job is to figure out who's actually going to do something and to help them do that. In many cases, that's the city. In many cases, it's a developer or a citizen, and usually it's actually a combination of the two. So you figure out how can you get things done, whether it's, we've written comp plans, we've written full downtown plans, but a lot of the stuff we've done has just been action plans. Okay, great, you all had a plan in place 10 years ago. It looks like it's got some great ideas. How can we come back now and actually make things happen from the plan that you had? That ends up being a lot of the type of work that we do.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful because it's not just saying, this is where this should go. This is where this, we like, there's often that sense with zoning. And I was down in Port Arthur, Texas, where
Mm.
they had a wonderful master plan of what their downtown was, but a bomb had gone off, not a literal bomb, but several hurricanes and disinvestment. And so they had everything identified where everything would go, but actually no action to take, no small steps to sort of kick things off. And there was no sort of focus from my perspective on what it took to actually just do the things that build that organic matter in the soil again to sort of regrow
Right.
the capacity within a place. And do you want to touch a little bit on the idea of Roman concrete versus modern concrete, the idea of, these core ingredients, and how is it that that drives your vision of projects and practices that build lasting prosperity?
Sure. So ash and lime are the ingredients of Roman concrete. It's the type of name that people don't necessarily love when they see it because they don't know where it is, or they assume that we're a construction company or something like that. But actually, if you look at the volcanic ash that they had at the time, um, they could actually make concrete that strengthened over time, which is why you still can go to Rome or to places within that empire and see buildings that are still intact. What we figured out was, and this is, Strong Towns has articulated this better than anybody, I think, and they've articulated it in the years since we even founded this company very, very well. These are timeless principles. We're not inventing anything, right? We can go back to medieval times, to ancient times, and we can see the way that we're working, the way that we're doing things incrementally, the way that we're doing things bottom up. Um, this is as old as civilization itself. Just as one example, I've been looking a lot at the medieval fair, right? This ultimate pop-up type of event. And I've been studying just kind of on the side how these temporary events had permanent impacts on cities that you can still observe today, right? It's like they tested something out, they did it on a small scale, but it ended up having permanent impacts. So I think that ash and lime is this idea that these are timeless principles. And obviously we have to, it's 2024, so things have to be adjusted to our current needs and conditions. But all of this stuff is very, very old, and we have a lot to learn. We threw too many things into the dustbins of history that turned out to be very foundational for how to build and evolve a civilization.
Yeah, I remember my wife did a study trip to Normandy, and as part of it, they went into the town, and there was a Renaissance fair, but it was right within the community because it wasn't something that was, out at the outskirts. It was actually because the stage was set for human activity in really important ways. And maybe this raises a question, like when you work with various communities, are there some sort of key factors that signal a sense of readiness to do this type of work? Because I think of, we have civic leaders that jump on these calls that are
Right.
part of the Strong Towns movement, and civic leaders in the broader sense, not just elected officials, but actually like staff, but and chiefly when I say like influencers within the community that can really begin to shape the discourse and sometimes want to know, like, what should I be setting my community up to be like? And it sounds like if they are an attractive client for a firm like yours, they've already been moving in a certain direction. What does that look like?
Well, so I think I would start with the last thing you said, that we all have to have the humility to realize that almost any community that we come into, people had been setting the foundation for 20 or 30 years, right? And I think that it's a tempting shortcut. It probably would have been in some ways an effective shortcut in the short term for me to walk in without humility, and when something happens to say, I did this, look at what I did. Look, and but it's like, no, I'm giving people tools and resources who've already been in many cases doing this for decades. So there's always a foundation set, even a place, usually if you go into a town, even if it feels depressed, there's still people who've been pouring their heart and soul into that place for decades usually, right? But I think in terms of where I could be most effective, having worked in a huge variety of places, um, and actually having a business that started out so slow that I couldn't say no to anything, turned out to be a tremendous blessing. And what I've learned is I don't really care that much where a place is. And you can see the portfolio of projects that we've worked on. We actually do need to update that a little bit, but you can, as Norm gave a link, you can see a lot of projects that give you an idea of this. But I don't really care if it's, here's this very developed downtown that's 100 years old versus here's this place where if you squint, you can kind of see maybe a block of Main Street. I'm happy to work with any of those places. What I really want to see is that there's someone there who's willing to help to take the next step. That can be a Main Street manager, that can be an economic development person, that can be a developer who's very enthused. And it's really about giving those people tools and giving them permission and getting them excited about what to do. And just, setting the policies in place to make things easier for them, but also giving them some design and some inspiration. So right now, I just co-founded this thing called the Storefront Renaissance League. It's about 6 weeks. We already have our first official client with a contract that we've already started on, which I'm very excited about, faster than I expected. Corsicana, Texas. I had done some work there before. It's about an hour away from Dallas, and it was once one of the wealthiest communities in Texas. It's actually the first place west of the Mississippi where they found substantial amounts of oil. So, it's a really cool place to work. It's an hour away from Dallas, but it's kind of the direction, it's not the direction of development. So it's, if you go from Dallas to Houston, so if you went an hour north of Dallas, you'd still feel like you were kind of in the suburbs. Here you don't. So we're looking at, what can we do? There's a fantastic Main Street manager there. There's other great leadership there. And it's really just a matter of, you know, what's an opportunity? An opportunity is wherever somebody is, if they're ready to take the next step. If a storefront is desolate and empty, but someone says, hey, I'm willing to make improvements in it, and let's figure out a way maybe to do some business incubation, do some pop-ups, that's an opportunity. But if someone's storefront is a 9 and they're ready to take it to a 10, that's an opportunity too. So wherever I go, it's my job to take things to the next level. I would say I'm very blessed in retrospect that, and I kind of alluded this before, that I wasn't able to cherry pick my projects, because I think if I had been, I would have decided that only certain types of places were worth my energy. And thank goodness that I don't have that attitude, and that I've been given too much humility to think that. And because my job is to help people reach the next level. It's like if someone's a teacher, is it more worthwhile to say, okay, well, this is a kid who's 2 grades ahead. Is that kid more important than the one who might be 2 grades behind? No, of course not. Is it more important to teach a ninth grader rather than a fifth grader? Of course not. Your job is figure out where someone is and help to figure out what's exceptional and how they can be their best self. I found so many places that had exceptional assets where I might have just passed by and thought there was nothing there. But this process has forced me to say, okay, I'm getting paid, so what's here? And sometimes I've been blown away by what I've found.
That really echoes for me part of my story as to how I even came across strong towns. As I was trying to figure out how is it that we have these storefronts right on, in the core of where the village was that we were living in, that are obliterated by the Strode that just ran right through them, and also sort of limited by the fact they could never keep clients, or the tenants never stayed, and there was always this turnover. And so we lacked nice things. And I guess it touches on one, maybe there's two elements of the question. One is like, what are those key elements of a street that you see as in Strongtown's language, like serving as a platform for building wealth? What are some of those key things that make places more productive? And what do you do to unlock that productivity is maybe a second aspect of that. And then I'll save the second question. The second question will be like, what do you do when like people are like, we just actually don't even have something that resembles a retail street or a high street to be able to work with? Anything that looks like a storefront is first, swamped by all the parking up front or things like that. But what about on the first one? What makes these places like more productive, and what does it look like to unlock that? I feel like there's some lessons that we can learn from you here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing is maybe to make sure that you're thinking of productive in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Because these main streets, it's easy to only think about financial productivity, which is of course essential, and of course everybody agrees about money, so sometimes money becomes the metric. But these are also really important places socially, culturally, as hearts of the community, and so forth. So I think that, I mean, first of all, you have to have space for people, and it can't be completely dominated by the automobile. And what you've seen a lot in my state and in other states is a lot of places that were, it's like Jim Kunstler talked about the three purposes of these main streets. And they used to be that they were the economic heart of the community, that they were the social heart of the community, and that they were conduits for traffic of various kinds, right? Whether that's people driving through, people, having a truck go through, people walking through, that these were conduits for traffic. And now they become conduits for one type of traffic, essentially motor vehicles. And as long as that happens, you can't really create spaces for people. So obviously, we normally need to have cars, but to have cars in their place, and to balance that with other needs that you have for these places, so that these aren't just what we might call stroads. I think besides that, there's certainly design characteristics. Having the right form and the right relationship of the storefronts to the street is probably more important than the design of the building itself. It's like I can take you to, I think of Chicago, on Clark Street, in Lincoln Park in Chicago. There's some buildings that would be as nondescript as you could imagine if you put them into a strip shopping center. But because of where they are, because they face the street, and because they have very active uses, people are going to go, oh, look, there's this cool Thai place, or there's this cool music store. And most of them are not going to notice that the building is extremely nondescript. So I think that's certainly key. But I think also thinking of the programming, thinking of the public spaces, there are certain design characteristics that are important, such as creating a sense of enclosure. I think having some places that are special, can help to make it a lot better. Before COVID, I used to say something that I was deludedly optimistic enough to assume, and when it was April, May of 2020, that everybody was going to get this now, and everybody still doesn't get this. What I'll say is, imagine that you put $10 million worth of infrastructure into your downtown, and imagine that at the same time you lose your 10 people's favorite businesses, and they're not replaced by anything, right? All of that, all of that investment is meaningless, right? So it's like you have to have places that are good, you have to have places that are interesting, in addition to having kind of the elements and in addition to paying close attention to detail. I think that that's a place that makes a street productive, um, financially, socially, culturally, and fiscally, in a lot of other different ways, are the types of things. We've started in situations where you're really starting from nothing. In fact, one of the projects that I'm proudest of was, I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with Monty Anderson. This was the Grow DeSoto project, which we worked on, very early on, which was in a nondescript strip shopping center, on, basically a nondescript Strode. And it was remade into a really cool business incubator. It helped to design stuff outside where you have a gathering area where you can, people can sit and chill and go to food trucks. And inside, you've reprogrammed the space and made it so that you're lowering the barrier to entry for entrepreneurs. You might call it an incubator, an accelerator, however those terms are loaded. You're basically helping to create unique businesses. So give space to people. If there's a gap, fill the gap. whether that means that there's spaces that are active for certain times but not others, whether you have vacant storefronts, whether you have, a piece of grass that could have seating and where you could have movies and concerts. Find ways to fill in, if you have a lobby that you could be serving, a lobby of a theater that the city owns, and you could be serving coffee there, you could have an art gallery there. Fill in gaps, give spaces to people, just figure out what your next step is. It's like, okay, we don't really have a street, we have this very nondescript thing. Can we have a little bit of seating area for people? Can we give people shade? Can we have any type of commerce here? Can we put in, a frozen ice stand or a hot dog stand? Like whatever the next step is, can we do things to create visual arts and to create cues for people? And don't focus on what you don't have. The other point that's related is once you look closer at what you do have, you will astound yourself, or the place will astound you, right? So, we had one client, they had us, this was during COVID, peak of COVID, or close to peak, not quite peak, but they're saying, okay, we're going to do a strategy to help support small businesses, and they assigned us to a corridor that bisected the two lowest income communities in the city, but that was also strip suburban. You would just pass it by, right? So the first thing we're like is, I can't think about 3.2 miles of this, but let's zero in on some things. And we start finding all of these special places. We found we go into just kind of a Mexican restaurant / grocery store, and we're talking to these people, and it's like, well, people come from 75 miles away every weekend to go here. Why do people come from 75 miles to go to go to this place? Well, this is a rural community. When we came here, this was about 2% people of Mexican descent in 2000, and now it's 7%. And now all the other communities are 7%. So we came in early on. We were like, we need to do an event space. We need to have some vendors outside that celebrate our culture. We need to have a credit union. We need to have a store. And it's this place that's like, oh, this is a cultural treasure for people all around here. And we didn't even know about it. It's like you start talking to people, it's like, like you have a culture that has really strong visual cues associated with it. And I wouldn't have known this was anything for passing this by. I would have just zoomed past by here. We found a lot of other really fantastic assets like that. So I think the point is, and I have parallels everywhere I've worked where you've been like, oh, this is nowhere here. And it's like, no, there's special stuff here. You just need to celebrate it, and you just need to come in knowing you're going to find some really cool stuff, and knowing that people who are already there may not realize how cool it is. So you have to be there and help to celebrate it.
I love that. I mean, there's a ton packed in there of just like filling the gaps, but also zeroing in on the places where there's maybe a landlord that's amenable to changes happening in their space, or like you said, even open to the idea, oh, what if we change the exterior just modestly, or there's a small micro grant for exterior renovations or things like that. And I think this is something that our local conversations are really poised to be able to be available to kind of do the very thing that you said, which is like zero in, identify the gaps, and then start to tease, sort of like a detective, like, why is this gap here? What is it that led to it? And it may be that you never actually have a seat at the table to be the person making the development happen. But we've got a local
Right.
conversation leader up in Kamloops, BC, and he's actually created a bit of a business for himself of showing up at, there's a large bank property near a store that he happens to own. And so he went up to the bank and he said, you don't intend to be in the owning of real estate very much longer, because most banks have sold, they lease their properties. He said, what are you going to do with it? They said, well, I don't know. I mean, we'll sell it. And then that's the next person's question. He said, what if we actually conjured up community support for what this will be, and then you can sell a concept, a vision, and a community on board with you in that type of thing. And those are placemaking things that I think really, really matter. Appreciated what you said also about like some of these areas with high velocity traffic and trying to address what's happening there. I want to shift gears just to two more questions, and then we'll take questions out of the and have more
Sure.
open discussion as well. But the one is on maintenance, and then the second on public engagement. So in terms of maintenance, I do wonder, like, what are the fads in urban design or placemaking that stand at odds with what we would say is a commitment to persistent maintenance as well as adaptation or iteration on things?
I mean, I think it's such a constant theme of the silver bullet theme, right? Like, I mean, I think that's so much at the heart of what Strong Towns is, and and maintenance and attention to detail are kind of in the same category. You know, nobody gets politicians don't get the big credit and the big attention for doing the basics and doing maintenance, or and economic development, planning professions. I just posted something recently that it's like, I got my master's degree in urban planning. I was working for, the CNU and the APA and Center for Neighborhood Technology when all those organizations were in Chicago, right? So I'm talking to, I'm looking at videos, I'm meeting with thought leaders, and I'm like, oh, I've met all these really incredible people. I go to, after years of this, I go to Fort Worth, and I discover this whole better block concept. So I end up doing a better block concept while I'm working in the city of Fort Worth. We do a neighborhood cleanup, right? And everything looked completely different after the cleanup. So it's like, oh, like, we're focused on all of these grandiose things. And at no point ever in all of this sort of education and training did anyone ever say, maybe the first thing you should do is clean up the trash. So we're just not, I mean, I think the why is, I kind of understand why, because nobody gets credit for basic cleanup, and maintenance is not as fun, it's not as glamorous, but it's the way that you get there. And I think that's closely related to attention to detail. I'm several blocks away from our convention center hotel in Dallas, our Omni Hotel. And we spent $1 billion on the convention center. We're gonna have a $2 billion convention center that the voters approved of. So that'll solve all of our problems. That's gonna be amazing. Yes, but in the meanwhile, we only have a $1 billion convention center that's completely desolate, and the area around it. And in this Omni Hotel, there's literally, you go a block away, it's literally pitch black. If you were to go between the Omni Hotel and the heart of the downtown, you would literally have to walk through pitch blackness. You can imagine they have this major national cheerleading event where you have middle school girls and their moms walking around. They're not going to walk around in pitch blackness. You have not paid attention to any attention to detail. So all of that stuff is connected. And the funny thing is, it seems unglamorous until you see what the results are. It doesn't sound like it's a lot of fun to go into a neighborhood and give everybody pizza and clean up the trash, but it looks a lot better, and so it feels better, and people look at it even if they're not conscious. They're like, oh, this place is starting to come back. So what seems like it might be exciting is very different than what is actually exciting. Like, so if I had my way outside this convention center, we'd be putting out string lights, we'd be putting out food trucks, we'd have things lined down, we'd have little areas in some of these parking lots that would be activated. And before you know it, you'd be in this West End neighborhood where my office is, and you'd be like, oh, this is this cool neighborhood. And it would be a lot of fun. So these things that people think are not as visionary as having a big convention center, well, the area around the convention center is depressing, and paying attention to detail and maintenance is actually not depressing. It's actually very joyful.
Yeah, and then let's also just touch on, you take a very different approach to sort of the obligation, the necessity, but actually also the opportunity of public engagement and what it takes to do it in a meaningful way. On the Strongtown site, I'll share an article where Chuck, talked about the fact that most public engagement is worthless. And then we had another person from the city of Vancouver chime in and say, like, no, most public engagement is worse than worthless. Like, it's actually can be very damaging. I know that you take that very seriously, and the critique it has informed in part your desire. Like, we need to always be doing better by the people that we serve. What does that look like for you? How do you allow for deep, nuanced conversations that oftentimes these types of settings sort of skip?
So first of all, look up, it's what I would say is look up synonyms of the word engage. And if you're not trying to do anything of those synonyms, then you're not even attempting public engagement. You know, if you're not trying to involve people, if you're not trying to immerse people, if you're not trying to captivate people, then you're not even attempting to do engagement. You've made a nonsense word that's just a buzzword. So the I think that there's kind of two levels of this, right? Because I work very incrementally, but the funny thing is that I want to actually get you excited about something that's very, very visionary, right? So it's like we finished working in this town of Rockdale, Texas. We might end up doing a little bit more work for them. But this is, it's less than an hour from the suburbs of Austin, and it's an hour and some change from College Station, and it's an hour and some change from Waco. It's kind of not in a super developed area, and this was where Alcoa was until 2009. They have a little presence there, but not much. So this was a huge company town. At one point, if you worked for Alcoa in that area, you had to be within the city limits of Rockdale. So real company town. And so it's like we work incrementally, but it's also, hey, like, how do you fight back? Like, you've been knocked down. How do you fight back? You're going to have development outside of your community, right? Because you're having industrial development. They're building residential development, and it's like, okay, well, you're gonna take this from them? Like, you were telling me about this great downtown you have, this history, this character, this sense of community you have. Let's fight back. Let's have some inspiration. So that has to come in, and you want to get people engaged on this. Like, what is our mission? What is our vision? This place is special. How do we fight for it, right? So on the one hand, it's like you have this very strong vision, but on the other hand, it's not like you say, okay, let's build a giant convention center. It's like, what do you have downtown that's special? How can we have places for people to go? How many places are many times of the year? How do we create an environment for small businesses? You've got all these empty storefronts. How do we fill them? So you want to get very grandiose in some sense, but in the ends, but the means are kind of pedestrian. But then it doesn't feel that way once you actually experience it. When you're like, wow, this is such a cool place because you have that. A lot of the engagement has to be informal. um it's like you're building public support. You're actually trying to figure out what the T is. You have to have a clear goal. So if I'm going into a downtown, it's like, what I want to figure out are, what are the next steps that you have that you can take with the actual people who are there. Not, what did I come up with it as an outsider? If I came in as an outsider and I'm like, hey, look at this great idea I have for these 3 storefronts. Well, Bill, who owns these 3 storefronts, once you talk to him, that he's not going to do anything, or from other people that he's not going to do. Yeah, he says he's going to do something, but he's all talk, right? So the best idea is one that you can actually make happen, and then you find out with insider information, even if it's informal, what you can make happen. You'd be shocked, if you haven't done this yet, on how much you can learn if the community affords this type of way of approaching it. If you can say, okay, I'm going to stay in a bed and breakfast downtown. I'm going to open the coffee house, and our team is going to close down the bar, and we're going to set a certain amount of meetings, and we're going to talk to people. And if I end up, sitting in a tile shop in the back room, for a total of 6 hours over this 3-day period, that's fine. We're not going to get into a car unless we need to. We're going to walk and walk and walk and make observations and talk to people. You can find an enormous amount. And you are saying, your goal is to say, how can I help you to reach your long-term goals? It's like, I was in Corsicana talking to someone who's a business owner or a property owner. I found myself asking that over and over again. Like, you want to do, really transformative stuff, you're already doing great stuff. You want to do even better stuff. What do I need to put into this report that can help you? So that's kind of the entire you want to be practical about it, and then and then if somebody says, okay, I want to do this, it's like, okay, you're looking to do this with food trucks here, you want to have this activation, here's how you can do this, here's maybe some of the things you need to watch out for. Let's create some designs and let's leave behind some inspiration. The best thing I can leave behind is inspiration. And I have to write down what I tell people just so that I can claim it in terms of my portfolio, or that I can have conversations like this. But if I really do my job, most of the people who are there are not necessarily going to really care or remember that I was there, because it's not about me. So that's the other thing. It's like that constant humility of I'm giving them the resources, and I need to get credit from the city in the sense that they'll hire me again, hopefully. I need to get credit on my portfolio, and maybe I need to give myself enough credit to know, yeah, I could be working a city job and having a pension and guaranteed income and guaranteed healthcare, and I'm choosing not to do it, and I stand behind it. But if I need my ego to be stroked, I shouldn't be doing stuff in this way. I'm in the wrong approach or wrong line of work if I'm not primarily a resource for other people.
So I want to pick up on that, because I mean, we do know of a certain class of people that often want their ego to be stroked, and that would be local politicians. And Hunter's asked this question out of Chicago. Hunter's also been a student in Ann Arbor, so seen it in a number of different places. How to create systemic change in larger communities where the political leaders, in order to get reelected often, but also maybe out of their own ambition, want to do big projects, want to bring in sort of big dollars, want to have big openings, and just are oblivious to or sort of disinterested in the needs of local maintenance and fiscal responsibility, because there is also a knock-on effect that voters generally are not observant of maintenance, are not sort of aware of it. I love what you said, like all of a sudden a cleanup can actually make a big difference, but there's so many other elements of maintaining what we have already built. What does that look like? And I guess, especially on the question of for larger communities where it just feels like the machinery is so, all the gears are already lined up and it just keeps moving the way it's moving. How do we disrupt that?
I mean, first of all, you have to be happy with getting on base. You have to be happy with getting singles.
Yeah,
By the way, I've lived in both Ann Arbor and Chicago, interesting
cool.
enough. But so you can't, I think you go crazy if you focus on things that you can't control. And we all know that we work within larger systems. A huge amount of my work ends up being navigating politics. It's going to be very rare that everybody in a city or everybody who has power is going to see things the same way. So you have to figure out who sees things a certain way and how you can make progress. And sometimes, dealing with big egos is always, you just have to have a lot of understanding of who you're dealing with. Sometimes it's just, I've just seen situations where it's like, you know what, this person's going to show up, and I'm just not going to make a big deal of what I'm doing. Let them think that I'm just some goofy person doing the kid stuff over here, and that they're doing the big adult stuff, right? It's a matter of not being big on egos. But I think that figure out where people are coming from, figure out what language they're speaking. Don't, you don't need to figure out where you can sell people on specific ideas and specific recommendations. In a lot of cases, you're putting in recommendations that maybe even the people who are most like-minded don't necessarily see at the time, but that they may be able to use later. It's like I got contacted one time by somebody who I had worked on the comp plan for, and he was, talking about various issues he was concerned about supporting small businesses. And I was like, well, you can tell them that this is already in the comp plan, that to do X, Y, and Z. It's like, oh yeah, like that was already put in there. You know, it's you can't worry about, you can only do what you can do. And, I think on one time on Chuck's podcast, it was like the door is not always open, but if you're not pushing, you're not going to be pushing when it is there. I have actually found that there's a lot of places where I worked that don't necessarily fully remember that people don't necessarily fully remember that I worked there, that I'll get people going, did you work in city X? And it's like, yes. It's like, okay, I could tell. That happens to me all the time. And I don't get people asking about places where I haven't worked as I think about it, right? So it's like you're maybe once or twice, but your fingerprints are on it. So I can know that, as much as I've taken a lot more L's than I have wins, right? I can also come and visit places and experience and see people experiencing a place where I can show where I made it better, and I can tell that I made it better. So it's a lot. I don't know if that's an answer to the question, because it's just a hard question, because it's just how do you navigate politics, which are necessarily about huge egos. And sometimes you're advising, sometimes the people who you're dealing with, who are the actual most competent and active people, work with someone who's less so, and you have to kind of be like, um, maybe you just need to tell this guy, hey, I thought this was a great idea that you said to do X, Y, and Z.
Mhm.
I've seen that work. Hey, I want everyone to, Tom here said, X, Y, and Z was a great idea. So, can we applaud Tom for it, right? Like, it's amazing how much you can get done if you don't need credit for all your work, or um, if you don't need certain types of credit, if
Mhm.
that makes sense to you.
100%. I love that. We've got about 10 minutes. Does anyone want to jump in with a question for Rik or commentary on what he shared already? Some great stuff in the chat, but if anybody's feeling inclined, just unmute and jump on in.
Can I do a follow-up question
Yeah, that's
on
awesome,
the
Hunter.
thinking?
Go for it.
I guess kind of building off the question earlier, how do you make sure that your work after you leave, given this kind of egos and dealing with politics and everything else, you kind of said like, oh, you can tell where your work was touched, or like the cities where you've made an impact, and just kind of thinking about how do you make sure that what you're doing is going to last, and that, let's say you get one political officer to kind of understand the importance of maintenance when they retire, how does that knowledge transfer get passed down where the community continues to care, maintenance continues to kind of have this focus on fiscal responsibility and not necessarily going after those flashy projects?
Yeah. So I'm going to be gone. It's like I'm going to be gone. So I've got to figure out how to give resources to people. One of the most effective ways that you can do this is by ensuring that the social structure is set up to do the right things. So in several cases, we've either created or enhanced a downtown association.
Right.
And or we've created stuff from scratch, but sometimes it's just like, okay, what are your goals? What are your objectives? And how can we help you to move the needle toward that, to clarify? So how can we align projects with goals and leave behind a structure where this can be pursued? So for example, if you go to most small towns, they have some event downtown that draws in a lot of people. A lot of people can mean different things for smaller towns, but it's like, okay, yeah, we've got this wine walk we do. Is it successful? Oh yeah, it's really successful. We bring in, more than 1,000 people every time. Okay. I talked to all of these small businesses, and they said that it's a nuisance for them, and that half of them are closed down, and that they, if anything, they're spending more time, making sure that people aren't shoplifting. So this hurts their business. So if your objective is bring a lot of people downtown, which they'll say a lot of times, yes, stated goals and actual goals are not the same sometimes. If your goal is really to bring a lot of people downtown, you've succeeded. But you probably have more important goals than that, maybe improving the image of downtown, or helping your small businesses, or maybe there are ideas that you need to test out. Hey, we've got this street here that's a couple blocks that's not really needed for transportation, and that could be a great pedestrian street, but the politics aren't there to do that. I've seen that in a few cases. When we do special events, can we shut down this street and see what it looks like and gradually start pedestrianizing it? Can we use this as an excuse to do pop-up retail? Can we test, some sort of street calming methodology while we're doing this special event to see how it works when a lot of people are here, right? But if you know your goals, you can work towards them, and you're leaving people to know their goals and to work towards it. In some cases, I've written substantial amounts of a plan with a specific person in mind. So if I know this is a really, really competent Main Street manager, and so what I have to do is, and I know kind of how they think, I've known this person for a while. So, working with, in this case, the prime, saying, how can we structure this so that we give instructions to this person that they can help to implement. Again, all of this stuff, I can't give you, there's not one size fits all answers to this. But you just have to kind of say, what can we do that gives people some sort of set of instructions or a set of inspirations. And they do, when you plant seeds like that, they do more than you think they will. It's like whatever you do that gives people that plant seeds, they will run with the ball in unexpected directions in many cases.
Yeah, appreciate that. Any other questions from the crew? We've got about another 5 minutes. I've always got a few, but I don't want to jump in unless I need to. All right. Well, I've got, so one of the areas that when we think of placemaking, one of the consequences of doing it right is that you're going to generate more investment, but that can also look like people with existing leases being told, hey, your rent just went up. And it gets to the point where perhaps if they're a store card that's selling collectible, baseball cards, they won't be able to remain in their same place. We just did an event in Langley, BC, where the retired fire chief said, all of my favorite places are getting driven out. And when you go and look, you realize it's sort of like the duck with the plastic ring around their neck. There are no other retail locations in the immediate vicinity. And so I
Right.
wanted your thoughts on how to sort of open up the zoning, whether that even looks like creating a buffer zone where there is always the option to add retail, even to the existing residential stock that's right in that area. And that can look like what we used to do, the conversion of doctor's office or houses into a doctor's office on the main floor, or accountants or lawyers or notaries. There's so many things like that that are within the bubble. And we see really tightly constrained commercial spaces. And even when the mixed use happens, it's retail, adding residential to the retail corridors rather than adding any kind of retail or service to sort of the surrounding areas. And the consequence of this is that you get these businesses that are really location dependent, say a Filipino market right next to the Roman Catholic Church, where there's also a Filipino Immigration Society office. And that's an actual example in Vancouver, where because their lease was up, they had to move. They had nowhere to move, so they moved to an industrial park, and the business failed. The community suffered, and it was a loss because there was actually available space immediately around it that could have been transformed, but it was in the wrong coding. How do you grapple with that? What does that look like for a place to have a plan as you placemake for it actually to account for its improved investments coming in, so that it doesn't drive everyone away?
I mean, so Eddie, the topic of gentrification in general, which this is a subset of, commercial gentrification, is always hard to have easy answers for. And if there's anything that I have the least easy answers for in 2024, it's the complications involved with gentrification. Like, I think that any honest answer has to start with that. I do think that on a case by case basis, looking at things like for example, in my neighborhood, Bishop Arts in Dallas, it really has expanded, not only because the traditional commercial district itself has expanded, but that you have a lot of residents that have been converted into businesses, including a place called Wild Detectives, which is my favorite place in Dallas. So you have a lot of that sort of thing that can kick in. I think that framing it as a zoning question is certainly only part of the issue. But I think that it's all about lowering the barrier to entry. So that's because once somebody has to say, okay, I'm going to do at least a 5-year lease and I've got to have great credit. And, if I want to have a restaurant, I'm probably going to need to do a grease trap and a vent-a-hood, and I've got to promote this. And if this fails, it's a disaster. So the question becomes, how do you lower the barrier to entry? So that's, flexibility in terms of being able to subdivide spaces, being able to have micro spaces, being able to have things like food trucks and other very small scale vendors and having the support around it. Having flexibility in terms of things like home offices and other businesses, making sure that the building codes are as flexible as possible to allow second stories and things like that. But I think overall, what you want to do is create a situation where if I make, if I have, fantastic dresses that I make, or I have great donuts, but I'm not really prepared to run a business,
Right.
that I can still come in and I can still do that. And and so we think also of, for example, making sure that there's flexibility to have multiple uses under one roof. So small towns tend to do this more than bigger cities, or you also have, other cultures, like especially, for example, Middle Eastern cultures, right? That tend to particularly do this, where it's like you can have one, if we think of the small town where you come in and there's, you can get ice cream over here, but in the back, you can get your nails done, right? So thinking about creative ways to do that. I think that's probably a whole separate topic, but I think if you
Yeah.
go by that guiding principle, that's going to point you in the right direction.
Yeah. I'm just sharing a podcast that we had about small scale manufacturing and the idea of reserving spaces in your downtown for these types of purse makers, lotion makers, dress makers, donut makers, those types of things, and the opportunities that emerges with that. We're coming up to our time, and I do want to close with the question that Danny's asked, which is, how does your company get engaged by a town or MPO or whomever is your client? Does a council person pitch you, or do you approach them? How does that work?
Um, I've made it up a lot as I've gone along over the last 11 years. I build relationships and I get approached. So I I so it's I build relationships. I have not. I've just only recently really even gotten my LinkedIn to the point where it's really been an attractor. So our website, I'm not unhappy with it, but I think it could use more. But we're starting to really do social media, doing a little bit of mass marketing. But basically, I've gotten to where I have through word of mouth and relationships, and every contract that I've gotten has been different. A lot of times I end up getting projects that I wouldn't have normally gotten through the Socratic method. So, here's what I mean. So hopefully we did a scope, hopefully we've got another scope coming up soon at University of Houston. University of Houston has an arts district and they want to figure out how to bring it to the next level. If you had looked at my resume, you would have said, hey, this guy should be planning an arts district for University of Houston.
Right.
But I started talking to them and it was like, after an hour, it's like, okay, so you've got this big plan that's going to come through. You're going to have all these big buildings that, in 8 years, you'll have, these massive investments. Are you doing XYZ that is part of this plan to do XYZ that might enhance the student experience in the meanwhile? So how are you looking at these spaces that you have? How are you looking at the performances? How are you looking at bringing people in? How are you looking at placemaking and branding and all of this stuff? And by the end of it, it was almost like, wait, have you thought about, have you worked for campuses before? It's like, no, but it's the same thing. this silver bullet is going to save us.
Mm.
And it never does. And you know, it's like, if you don't do the things that are the details on the ground, you're going to just mess up the student experience for the students who are already there without doing anything positive. Nobody, the student experience is not going to be enhanced by a bunch of construction. So it's like, what can you do that actually focuses on these things on the ground? And like, this conversation I'm having with this campus, and all the conversations I've had with these campuses, are the same as the ones that I've had with towns of 5,000 people, or with Dallas or Fort Worth or Houston, right? It's the same thing. So
Well, you think of the
I do think
placemaking that went into San Antonio and the river walk, which is just 2 blocks. Like, it's not even a large space, and yet it's become city defining, in part because it's just a place that has been actually, you know, rethought and given new fresh look and created an opportunity. We're at the top of the hour. I know, Rik, you've got to step away in just a moment
I
here
don't
as
know, I
well.
can keep
Oh, you're
talking.
okay. Okay. We'll wrap up the recording just for the folks that are watching this at home, but I do want to alert you that next week we'll be back on Friday, but then the following Monday, so September 16th, is a Monday. Chuck is going to be doing a session of office hours with our crew as well for members. And so you can look forward to that. I'll send out the email. It'll be the same meeting link, and I promise it'll work this time. But it will be available for you as we finish up. And so with that, thank you so much, Rik. I think Rik can stay on just a little bit if there's more questions,
Yeah.
but really appreciate this. This is great. It's yeah, awesome
And
stuff.
thanks for having me, and thanks. I probably haven't even been able to respond to all these comments, but thanks for all the great comments and feedback, everyone. So yeah.
Definitely. Great session, everyone.